Thanks, Dick. Yes. Yes, it's my very pleasant task to be introducing WebGeeks to you, and I shall do that, certainly. Now, one of the things we do in our network is to encourage Australian scholarship across the board of progressive thinking. And so this is one of the ways in which we do that, to invite a major scholar, Australian scholar, such as Greg, to come and address you this afternoon. And I know how much you're going to enjoy that, how much you get out of it. Now, there's quite a lot to say about Greg, so he can just sit there and squirm if he likes, but I am going to say it, so here we go. Right, Dr. Gregory Jenkes is an Australian religion scholar, and he's also an Anglican priest. You could probably tell that already, right? Yeah. He is Academic Dean at St Francis Theological College in Brisbane, and he's feeling the breezes down here as well, poor thing. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University. His PhD was awarded by the University of Queensland for his research, and this is very interesting, his research into the origins and early development of the Antichrist myth. Now, I don't know how often you think I must get a book on the Antichrist, but I'm sure it's fascinating. I don't think we have a copy though, do we, Smithy? No, never mind. If you're interested, Greg will probably tell you where to get it. Now, Dr. Jenkes has a long-standing interest in Christian origins and is the lead researcher for the Jesus Database Project. If you want to know more about that, you need to ask him later. He has been visiting professor and scholar in residence at St George's College, Jerusalem, on several occasions. He's also co-director of the Bethsaida archaeological excavation in Israel. Greg is a fellow of the West Star Institute, and he served as its associate director from 1999 to 2001. So, in addition to chapters that he's contributed to numerous books, his recent publications include, as Dick says, The Once and Future Bible, 2011, The Once and Future Scriptures, which I understand is a progressive approach to the Scriptures, and that's 2013. And of course, this latest book of his, Jesus Then and Jesus Now, and also this year, Wisdom and Imagination, which is co-edited with Rex Hunt. Greg has recently been awarded a Charles Sturt University Research Fellowship for next year, 2015, and this will allow him to focus on research into the Mamluk period in the Galilee, between the expulsion of the Crusaders and the advent of the Ottoman Empire. And his goal, he says, in that research is not simply to understand the past, but also to contribute to the reconciliation between the Jewish and Palestinian communities as they acknowledge each other's historical presence in the land and imagine a shared future beyond the current conflict. So, very important research going on there, that's for sure. Now, Dr. Jenkes has decided that if you have a copy of his book, it says Jesus Then and Jesus Now. So we're really going to do Jesus Then in the first half of the forum, and after a little break, then Jesus Now. So Greg will explain. So will you welcome Dr. Greg Jenkes.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Let me just bring up the file that I need for this. Those who were here earlier were trying to work out what the screensaver is. It's of course, but I mean it is the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, so that will give you a sense of where that comes from. So what I want to do I want to really set up a conversation, and probably the best time for the conversational part is in the second half. So I want to focus the looking for Jesus back then stuff by going on a search for the Nazareth of Jesus rather than the traditional quest for Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so I'm playing with that familiar phrase and saying, in effect, what do we know about, A, whether Nazareth existed in the first century, and if it did exist, what kind of place might it have been? Because that might give us a fix on the kind of opportunities and possibilities for Jesus. This really grew out of a kind of a side project while I was in Tiberias last year for 4 or 5 months. Tough gig, but someone had to do it, on sabbatical. And I was in conversation with friends in Nazareth, many of whom want to talk up the historical cred of their city. And I was a little bit sceptical about some of those things. So I wrote what turned out to be a 6,000-word book chapter for another person's book around the historical Nazareth question. And that's really what you're getting an overview of this afternoon. So I'm going to skip some of the detail, but just go into have a conversation about what might we perhaps know about Nazareth and indeed Galilean Jewish presence in the time of Jesus. So it's really it's as much about the historical Galilee as it is about historical Nazareth. And of course, it's pretty tough to get a fix on one individual figure from the ancient past 2,000 years ago, but it's not as difficult to get a fix on a village. Okay, that's a bit bigger target, leaves a bit more of a trace in history. So let's see how we go. So, and in doing all this, I normally do this if I'm speaking somewhere, but let me do it here as well and just bring to you greetings from the Christian community in Israel. That's very grand, but in particular from the Christian community in Nazareth, where I do have a number of connections. I know they appreciate the fact that we don't forget them, and particularly at this time, it's a bit more difficult. We'll talk a little bit about that in the after-break session as well. But this morning, friends, I woke to news that not only has there been renewed rocket and retaliation attacks in the south, but there are rockets coming into Galilee from the north, courtesy of Hezbollah. So it's an interesting and challenging time to be either Jewish or Palestinian in that land at this stage. So let's keep all of them, Jews and Palestinians alike, in our prayers. That's what Nazareth looks like today. If you come in over the crest of the hill to the rim, circle of hills where the city of Nazareth nestles in the bottom, you'll see this crammed-in city where urban planning is an afterthought. Okay, and it actually stands in vivid contrast to the nearby separate municipality called Nazareth Ilit, which means Nazareth Heights or Upper Nazareth, which is a Jewish city established in the 1960s, and it has broad streets, and they spend more money on watering the plants in the footpath in Nazareth Ilit than the whole of Nazareth gets for a year. So there are. And those streets are well planned, and it's a very nice neighbourhood. In fact, it's such a nice neighbourhood, it's now 40% Arab, even though the mayor of Nazareth insists there are no Arabs. Sorry, the mayor of Nazareth Ilit insists there are no Arabs living in his Jewish-only town. But the education department has said, actually 40% of your people are Arabs, you must now fund an Arab language school in Nazareth Ilit. So it's an interesting story, and it's a story of disadvantage and a story of opportunity, and they're still working it out, and let's wish them well, both Jews and Arabs, as they seek to work it out. So Nazareth today is a large, substantial city of around 65,000 people, with another 35,000 at Nazareth Ilit. So it's about 100,000 people, really in the one continuous urban area. That's the Church of the Basilica of the Annunciation, and I highlight that because of something we'll look at shortly. And down here you have basically the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation, St. Gabriel's Church, where they celebrate Luke's story, actually it's not even in Luke, but where they celebrate the tradition that Gabriel spoke to Mary at the well, and of course they will show you the well. So it's obviously the place, isn't it? And in between, where that dotted circle is, that's what I'll be suggesting on the basis of work by other archaeologists. That's probably the footprint of Nazareth in the first century. Okay, roughly 1 square kilometre, if that. Okay, so how do we get from 65,000, 100,000 people in Nazareth now back to what we might know about Nazareth in the first century? So maybe a surprise, perhaps not such a surprise in this kind of a crowd, to learn that there are people who question whether Nazareth even existed in the time of Jesus. And there are a number of reasons for that, and we'll just touch on them very briefly. So amongst the more, if you like, the radical edge of the historical Jesus kind of program, you get the sort of myth of Christ faction, as it were. It's a bit like the Life of Brian. And alongside them, with a separate packet of chips, you'll get the sort of myth of Nazareth people, who, whether or not Jesus existed, they don't think he came from Nazareth. It was all just made up by the Catholic Church to drive the pilgrim trade. And it's not beyond the wit of that multinational, long-running organisation to do that. However, historians can be sceptical of all claims, not just of the negative ones. And of course, it's really part of this debate between maximalists and minimalists, and people like me tend to be minimalists. So I was not intrinsically opposed to the proposition that Nazareth didn't actually exist in the time of Jesus and is no more historical than Mount Beatitudes or the feeding site at Tagba. We do tend to take a story, find a suitable piece of geography and say it happened here. So, in theory, I would have no, in principle, objection to an outcome which said, actually, Nazareth didn't exist in the first century. But let's go in quest of the evidence. And in this case, it's a religious argument, of course, as well as a historical argument, as many of these things are. And it's becoming one of the emerging points of debate around the sort of radical historical questioning. For someone like me, that's interesting. I'm not only practicing Christian, Anglican priest, I'm also somebody who has a personal affiliation with Nazareth, so I'm interested in the story. And they don't appreciate me saying, actually, guys, I think Jesus was born here, not in Bethlehem, because that causes other problems for them. But I do have my own personal interest in the kind of the story of this place and the people who live there today. So what's the core data? Well, the core data is that almost 30 times we get references to Nazareth in the Bible. The problem is all of them are in the Gospels and the book of Acts. Okay, Nazareth never occurs anywhere in the Old Testament, anywhere in the intertestamental literature, whether canonical or extra-canonical, and nowhere in the post-biblical literature, really, except for a couple of quotes in the 2nd century, which are dependent on Luke, until you really get right down to the 4th century. So Nazareth was nowhere town. It was, if anything, a very small village that literally virtually no one had heard of. And Jesus comes from there, according to the tradition. Okay, so that's the basic issue. And most of the time when Nazareth occurs in the New Testament, it's in the phrase Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. It's not actually saying, and they came to the village of Nazareth, or it's very much connected with Jesus' own identity in the tradition as somebody who comes from a village called Nazareth. Now, the broad solution in many ways, of course, is that Jesus was a very common name for Jewish males at the time. It's Joshua, Yeshua, okay? And there would have been lots of Jesuses running around in Galilee at the time, and he tended, according to the tradition, to operate down by the Sea of Galilee. So the obvious way to distinguish this Jesus from the other Jesus characters was to say, the one from Nazareth. And Nazareth, really? You got enough guys up there to have one called Jesus. So that's the kind of historical scenario that I'm kind of leading towards. This is one of the earliest graphic representations of Nazareth. It actually comes from the 19th century, because Nazareth was actually not an easily accessed place for most of the last 1,500 years. And the general drift there is that for most of the last 1,000 years, Nazareth would have averaged around about 1,000 people. The question is, and there's no question that there's no doubt that Nazareth is there in the Byzantine period, 4th, 5th, 6th century. There's no question that Nazareth is there in the Crusader period, 10th, 11th, 12th century, the question is, was it there in the 1st century? Because if it wasn't there in the 1st century, Jesus came from somewhere else. So we get this issue. So we know that historically the city, the village, the town was a relatively small place that would only at a few moments in history, like the Crusader period, get beyond 1,000. Going at the beginning of the British Mandate period, 1918, there were 8,000 people when the Brits did the census. And that itself reflected a significant economic and population upgrade during the 19th century, particularly due to sort of Russian interest in Palestine. As an aside, my Arabic teacher, who's in Nazareth, her grandfather was a mayor of Nazareth and a member of the first Israeli Knesset in 1948 as an Arab parliamentarian, but he went to the Russian school in Nazareth as a child and spoke Russian and spoke Arabic and Russian. And we tend to forget that the Russians not only were there, but were there for a long time, and they have ambitions to come back. So because of a significant upgrade in European interest and the possibility of European pilgrimage, places like Nazareth actually saw substantial growth in the last few decades of the 19th century through into the beginning of the 20th century. By the time the Brits left in 1948, the population had more than doubled to 18,000. By the early 60s, it was 25,000, and as I've said, it's currently 65, plus another 35,000 people on top of the hill. So there's this pattern of development. As I've said, it's well attested in critical times, if you like, of Christian supremacy. During the Byzantine period, when the whole of the Holy Land is sort of Christianized, and the sort of Byzantine regime put its stamp and the Christian stamp on the landscape, and of course again in the Crusader period. So the question becomes, what's the evidence for this place existing prior to the Byzantine period, and can we trace it at all back into the 1st century, or indeed further back beyond the 1st century? Now, there are some other methodological questions that I don't want to spend time on, but they're worth noting. It's of course possible that what we call Nazareth did not exist in the 1st century, but Nazareth actually existed somewhere else, and we've simply got the name wrong. Okay? That's certainly a possibility, because ancient sites do not come with signs saying, "Welcome to Bethsaida, we love our children, please drive your chariot slowly." Okay, so we always have to engage in a process of probability analysis to say, given all the pros and cons, is this anonymous tell, actually Nazareth? Or was it Nazareth in the 1st century? Towns do shift from one bump to another. So even if there was no evidence of 1st century occupation at this site, that would not actually prove that Nazareth didn't exist, just that the present Nazareth didn't exist. That location was not occupied 2,000 years ago. And of course, I suspect it overrates the significance of the question. Whether Jesus was born at Nazareth, if he existed, he was born somewhere. So one level, who cares? But for the point of this exercise, I'm interested. So the track into it, I'm suggesting, is actually to pay attention to what's been happening in sort of Galilean scholarship, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, as there's been a kind of maturing of the archaeological studies that are being done in the north of Israel. So that whereas previously analyses and reconstructions of what life was like in the Second Temple period, and particularly in the Galilee and Judea and Samaria, were essentially based on the text, the literary texts, the Gospels, and most importantly the writings of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, who was the commander of the Jewish forces in the rebellion against the Roman Empire, and he was the commander of the Jewish forces in the Galilee. And he swapped sides halfway through. He ended up with a government pension in Rome, and he writes a self-serving account of what a hero he had been. But in the process of doing that, he describes lots of locations and battles and characters and so on, and not once does he have any occasion to mention Nazareth, although he mentions other nearby villages, which are now part of Nazareth today, because Nazareth has grown out to absorb them. But because of the great increase in archaeological study through the 70s, 80s and 90s and continuing, we're in a much better sense to understand the kind of dynamics of Jewish presence in the Galilee in the 1st century BCE and, of course, 1st century Common Era. The headline summary of that is that round about 100 BCE, the Hasmonean dynasty, which had followed on from the Maccabean revolt, engaged in a policy of expansion. They expanded to the south and absorbed Idumea, or the Edomites, into Jewish life. They expanded to the north and occupied Samaria, and in the process burnt down the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. That'll teach them. And around about 100 they expanded up into the Galilee and attempted to absorb the Galilee into the Jerusalem ambit, actually for the first time ever. All right, David and Solomon never managed to pull that one off. Now, the first attempt, particularly in places like Bethsaida, where I'm digging, was not particularly successful, but we can see a change in the population. The ethnic markers change, the currency changes, pottery changes, various other artefacts change. So we know that the non-Jewish population had basically gone back to the Lebanese coast where they came from, and Jewish settlers are beginning to take over in some of the strategic locations in the Galilee. So some things are ancient, okay? Some dynamics, some strategies have been around for a long time. Then 50 or 60 years later, Herod, whose parents had been Idumeans, who had been absorbed by the Hasmoneans into Jewish life, he marries the last of the Hasmonean princesses, or the lady who turned out to be the last of the Hasmonean princesses, especially after he murdered her, and he is much more successful at promoting a policy of Jewish colonisation in the Galilee, probably because he had been the governor of the Galilee before he became king of the Jews. So he actually knew the place and he had an interest in it, and he succeeded in Judaising the Galilee. This particularly took the form of small agricultural settlements, and the people who populated those settlements came from Judea and were closely attached to Jerusalem and to the temple. And so my basic argument is going to be that Nazareth was one of those villages, one of those settlements. So it really excites my Palestinian friends when I say Jesus was the son of a Jewish settler community in the Galilee. It's hard enough for them to understand he's Jewish without being a settler. Now, of course, after Herod's death, the two sons who managed to survive and stay in power long enough were in competition with each other to get the nod from the emperor to take over the old man's patch, to become king of the Jews. And so again, some of the dynamics of Jewish population and urban development in the Galilee are driven by that competition between Philip and Antipas. And broader than our conversation today, this is where we get the significance of the redevelopment of Sepphoris, just a few kilometres from Nazareth. That's, of course, the wrong way around. Sepphoris is a city, Nazareth is a group of caravans in a circle. But, they were in proximity to one another, although, again, Sepphoris is never mentioned in the New Testament. So, the data is selective. We get references to Nazareth, and we get not a single reference to Sepphoris. Subsequently, Antipas establishes the city of Tiberias, while his brother decides to upgrade the fishing village of Bethsaida to be called the city of Julius. So we have a reasonable sense of what's going on in the Galilee in the couple of decades at the end, a couple of decades BCE, last couple of decades before the turn of the eras, and in the first couple of decades of the Common Era. Of course, at the time, none of the people living realised they were first century people. Okay? There were no people running around saying, "Isn't it great to be in the first century church?" Okay? They were simply in the 14th year of the Emperor Tiberius or whoever. So this is our language. We're putting our labels, our patterns over the leftovers of their lives. So I've skipped over several slides which are biblical texts to give you the data about Nazareth in the Gospels and the book of Acts. I want to jump straight to our first non-Christian reference. So the first time that anybody outside the New Testament, outside the Gospels and Acts, refers to Nazareth It's this 4th century inscription from Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea. This is the city of Caesarea that Paul goes to and occurs in various other references, of course, in the ancient literature. And there it is there, or I'll put it up on a bigger screen for you. There are 3 little tiny fragments of this inscription, and the bit that we're looking at is this one over here, which has the word Nazareth in it. So from those 3 tiny fragments, imaginative archaeologists can reconstruct the entire inscription, and it's a list of towns in the Galilee which are kosher, ritually clean towns for Jewish priests to live in the 4th century. And Nazareth is mentioned. Okay? That is the first time Nazareth occurs in literature, in text, inscription, outside of the Gospels and the book of Acts. Except for the infancy Gospel of James, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which are both derivative from the Gospel of Luke, so they're not independent witnesses. And of course we have pilgrimage reports from the Byzantine period, but that doesn't help us answer the question, was this lovely Byzantine town there in the 1st century? So we have to turn to archaeology, and that just happens to suit me just fine. So in the last 20 or so years, there have been a number of controlled excavations and surveys at various sites around Nazareth. So I'm going to take you on a very quick Cook's tour of the archaeological work around Nazareth. The first was the Catholics demolished the old Franciscan church to build a new basilica in the 1960s. And so that gave them a chance to take that patch back to ground zero, to bedrock. There were excavations at Mary's Well, which probably wasn't Mary's Well, but there were excavations at the well called Mary's Well in 1997, 1998, and the report has just been published about 2 years ago. There are a different kind of open land survey investigations going on in the valley between Nazareth and Zippori, which is the modern word for Sepphoris, and that tells us interesting stuff. There's a project called the Nazareth Village Farm in Nazareth, which is a reconstruction of a model Galilean peasant village, and as soon as you step inside they start trying to tell you it really is Nazareth, but nonetheless it's an interesting place to visit. And in the preparations for establishing the village, they did some excavations on that remarkably open piece of land just below the English hospital. And then there's the International Marian Centre across the road from the Basilica, where further work was done just a couple of years ago for an opening of a new centre in 2011. If you dig anywhere in Israel, you find ruins. They started putting down the foundations for this new Catholic pilgrimage centre. They found 1st century buildings, remains of 1st century buildings. The architect and the project manager was probably disappointed, but of course the actual owners of the project were delighted, because there's nothing like a bit of 1st century stuff to bring the pilgrims in. So that was all good. And just up the hill, 100 yards up the hill from the Basilica and the International Marian Centre, there's the Convent of the Sisters of Nazareth, and there's been some revisiting of the excavations done there in the 19th century. So let's go through each of these just quickly, one by one. This is a map showing the probable, the most significant archaeological sites that have been excavated around Nazareth in recent years. Down the bottom is what is essentially the Franciscan compound, and is widely recognised as the probable footprint of Nazareth in the early part of the 1st century. And it's really only about 1/2 kilometre by 1/2 kilometre square. Okay, it's a very small patch. And about 1/2 kilometre away is Mary's Well, with the Greek Orthodox Church. And certainly in antiquity, the well is described as being, in some of the pilgrim reports and so on, as being about 1/2 kilometre away from the village, because that's where the spring happened to be. They didn't have quite the same plumbing expertise for a small village that we'd find in a large city. So they're the two. So those two circles represent the clusters of archaeological material relevant to the early part of the 1st century. Okay, so let's just quickly go through them. This modest local indigenous piece of architecture is the Roman Catholic Basilica of the Annunciation. It's the biggest Christian church in the Middle East, and they're ever so proud of it. So what happened there? Well, there was a unique opportunity in the 1950s as they demolished the old church, took it back to bedrock and began to build the new church. And so this meant that a particular Franciscan excavator, Bellarmino Bagatti, was able to look at everything that could possibly be seen on the site. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he correctly interpreted everything that could be found on the site, but at least it's one of those rare times when you get to demolish a 19th, 18th century building and take it right back to the ground and count and measure everything from the Mamluk period, from the Crusader period, from the Byzantine period, till you get back to bedrock. So we've got a very significant exposure. So they've built the new basilica, and at various places they've left the basilica above ground, so it's not actually sitting on the ruins, on the tops of the caves and so on. And what you have is basically a series of caves, limestone caves, which are typical for this area, many of which have been reshaped and turned to various functions. Some of them have steps, some of them have elements on the top which show where walls had been sitting in grooves and so on. So we can reconstruct a complex set of natural caves which have been artificially modified, used for a variety of agricultural and domestic purposes, and in many cases interconnecting passages between them, because they were also a good place to hide when the bandits came. And the reason Herod was the governor of the Galilee was because they were having trouble with bandits, and one of his jobs was to suppress the bandits. Okay. So there's certainly evidence there of underneath the basilica of a network of caves used for a variety of domestic and agricultural purposes. That graphic it's a fair way away from where I was standing, but it's an attempt to show some of those grooves, which are like the sort of negative imprint of where walls were once sort of beveled into the top of the rocks and so on. So what have we got? We have these depressions that we're just showing you. We have the domestic buildings, and we have the consensus of the archaeologists that have looked at it and reviewed the findings in the light of another 50 or 60 years of kind of thinking, is that basically the modern Franciscan compound is the nucleus of a very small village from the Roman period. Now, of course, the Roman period is itself, from the Herodian top, from 63 BCE, through to about 250 is the early Roman period. So we still need a bit more fine-tuning there. This attractive structure is the current version of Mary's Well, okay, along with signs saying don't drink the water, because it's not potable water, which says something, doesn't it? So limited excavations were carried out there in 1997, 1998, and the detailed report was published about 18 months ago. So I said it's about half a kilometre, 500 metres away from the residential area, and it's actually a couple of hundred metres down the hill from the spring itself. So over the centuries, the water has been channeled to a convenient collection point. Many people, when they go into the Greek Orthodox Church, think they're at Mary's Well, at the spring, and that's what they want you to think, but the spring itself is another 100 metres or two up the hill, and the well is another 100 metres out the front, of course, these days. So what have we got? Well, in the case of water systems, special circumstances apply, because this is not a domestic structure that stays in one place. This is a set of channels with water flowing through it. People go there to collect the water, and in the process they drop stuff that they didn't mean to leave there, like an earring, or they drop a jug and it breaks in the bottom of the well. They lose coins. And no matter what point they drop it in the system, it's going to be washed down to the final collecting point at the final well, and it's going to sit there, and the mud is going to collect around it, and it's going to stay there until the city council fathers agree that it's time to clean the well. And every time you do that, you're going to get whatever has been dropped since the last time the well was cleaned. Well, the well was cleaned in 1997-98. It was last cleaned in the Mamluk period in the 15th century. So there's 500 years of mud and slush. And what we discovered, of course, we find vessels used for retrieving water which get dropped. You find jewellery, you find coins, and they all end up at the bottom. And in this case, what we found, this is what the back of that nice well looks like. And I find this much more attractive than the other side of the well, okay? Because I can see at least 3 or 4 different historical periods in that structure. If you start looking at the brickwork, it's like doing a home reno, and you can see how different people have modified the building over the years. There are hundreds and hundreds of years of municipal modifications being reflected in the back end of Mary's Well. Okay, so what did they find? Well, there were 165 coins turned up, but interestingly, 10% of them, 16 of them, were actually from the Hasmonean and Herodian period, despite the fact that the well had been cleaned at least a couple of times before the Mamluks. Okay, but because a modern archaeologist is more thorough, they're going to clean out every corner of the well. Whereas the city council workers, the village council workers in the 10th century or the 12th century, they're just going to clean it up enough so the water flows. And clearly they missed at least 165, well, they missed at least 16 coins from the Hasmonean and Herodian period. So presumably even more of them would have been found in the 15th century, but that's the luck of the draw. There were no archaeologists there to take notes when the Mamluks cleaned out the water system. So it's a particular significance that 10% of the coins, despite 1,500 years, or in fact 2,000 years having passed, 10% of the coins found there were coins from the 1st century BCE and 1st century Common Era. That's significant data in terms of archaeologists. Moving on to the stream, the river, the Nahal, between Zippori, Sepphoris and Nazareth. This is an open farming valley between 2 sets of hills. Sepphoris is up on the ridge that you're looking at. Nazareth would be behind. And the excavation or the work there has been done by Ken Dark, who currently is at King's College in London, and he surveyed the valleys, and his interest was to try and work out what difference the Byzantines made to the landscape in the 5th, 6th and 7th century. But to his surprise, he found that he was also discovering patterns of agricultural settlement in the 1st century, and that it was possible to distinguish a clear cultural divide between the villages closer to Sepphoris, which were more integrated into the Hellenistic Roman culture, and villages slightly further away from Sepphoris, such as Nazareth, who were highly resistant to Hellenistic engagement. So all those romantic pictures of tour guides telling people that, like the Snow White's 7 dwarves, Joseph and Jesus and all the boys from Nazareth hiked off every day to work in Sepphoris, building the palaces and so on for Antipas, they're probably nonsense, because the villagers from Nazareth would have nothing to do with the jerks from Sepphoris. And maybe that's why Sepphoris doesn't show up much at all, in fact, in the Gospel record. Now, Dark, who did a lot of this earlier work in Britain in terms of lines of cultural resistance to Roman presence in Britain, actually says that the demarcation is clearer in this valley than anywhere else in the Roman Empire. Okay, and his primary qualification is because he's done that kind of work at the other end in the British Isles. So that helps us to put another piece of the jigsaw together. Some of these Jewish settlers who may have been coming up from Judea and settling in the Galilee were actually pretty suspicious of the townies. And they were closely affiliated, closely connected with the temple and more traditional forms of Jewish life in the south, like the Scots who come to Australia and they're more Scottish than the Scots kind of thing. So then we get to Nazareth Village Farm. This was a small tract of land. These days it's part of the urban area of Nazareth. It had been acquired by the London Missionary Society 100 or so years ago. Top of the hill they built a hospital. The lower part of the site they've leased out to the YMCA. And in between there was some open space which they never got around to building anything on. In fact, friends of mine who grew up in the area used to play there as children. So this land, someone developed a project of saying, why don't we create a model village on the hospital land? Okay? And it's basically an evangelical tourist trap, so they can get you in and give you the 4 spiritual laws and all that kind of stuff. But they've done a pretty good job of the archaeological reconstruction. And as part of the project, course, they had to do a very detailed analysis of the site and what it could tell us. So what has come out of that work is that there are no structures, no domestic structures. This was not a place where people lived in the first century. Whereas half a kilometre or so away, the other direction, you do get the caves, the domestic structures and so on. We get ceramic remains, pottery, a few coins, but not coins that are relevant to the first century period. And we basically find evidence which is consistent with this being open agricultural space and not an occupied village domestic area. And so there's nothing powerful to come out of that except that it looks and feels like a bit of farmland that really has never been built on for whatever reason right through more than 2,000 years. But it does allow us to compare and contrast the data coming from the Nazareth village farm site with the data coming out of some of the sites which are in the central village area. Just up the hill from the basilica, about 100 metres up the hill, you can see Christchurch Anglican Parish, looking very English on the hill. I'm sure at the time it would have dwarfed the Catholic Church down the bottom, and the Catholics knocked it down and built the basilica. So the Anglican Church is now just a tiny little church in the shadow of the basilica. And halfway between the basilica and Christchurch, that little green sign, which is the convent for the Sisters of Nazareth. So what's going on there? Well, I've talked about its location. When the sisters were doing some excavations after they put up their first building in the late 19th century, they discovered structures. Absolutely clear there are Crusader structures and there are Byzantine structures. That's clear. These are fairly significant monumental structures. Again, underneath that, there were some other cave-related structures. Now, the problem was in the late 19th century, the excavations were done by the Palestinian labourers, supervised by the French nuns, and nothing was labelled, nothing has been properly recorded. So people have basically ignored it because it's not the kind of data you can get much of a grip on. More recently, Ken Dark, the same guy, has moved from surveying the valley to trying to make sense of this jumble of records and artefacts and so on, kept by the nuns since the end of the 19th century. And he's, again, his main interest is Byzantine, but he's noting on the way past where he finds material which is more reflective of the first century situation. Not monumental, very basic, very simple, the kind of structures which will be typical of first or second generation settlers taking advantage of natural caves, but also beginning to add some artificial elements to the caves to suit both domestic and agricultural functions. And he particularly draws attention to what he calls structure one, which is this particular room here, which will look like a jumble of masonry, and it is. There are several periods of construction work there, but you may be able to make out the contours of a cave, which has been reshaped to some degree. The cave wall is on the left, there's the earth floor on the ground, and there's a doorway leading into an adjoining room, adjoining chamber. These remains are certainly consistent with the kind of level of occupation and level of economic and technological development that you would anticipate in a first or second generation settler just arrived. Think back to the pioneer huts, in various parts of Australia as people, think back to the original huts in Melbourne and Sydney, for that matter. As people arrive, put up primitive shelters, then over a period of time it becomes a tad more sophisticated. So we seem to have, according to Ken Dark, and this is not uncontested, a well-preserved example of a first century courtyard house. That's a house with a couple of rooms and a courtyard, typical first century Jewish structure, very similar to similar kind of structures found 100 metres down the road at the International Marian Centre. Some of the walls have been plastered. That's not a natural feature. And there are some domestic artefacts which are typical Jewish artefacts and also reflect perhaps a Torah observant Jewish community, concerned for ritual purity and that sort of thing. Down the road, I said this was a quick tour, is the International Marian Centre. That was it, just poking its head up at the end of the lane. This was established in 2011. It's directly across the road from the basilica. In fact, the caves would be a continuation of the same complex of caves that we saw earlier. A rescue excavation, as it's called, was conducted in 2008-2009. It's the same excavator who did the Mary's Well excavations in 97-98, Yadena Alexandre. She hasn't yet published her report, but I've spoken with her and said, give me the dope on any coins. There were no coins found, unfortunately, but I've got her sort of simple description of what she will be publishing when her report comes out in full. And again, evidence of first century courtyard houses. Jewish occupants, one of the reasons we can say they were Jewish is because they were using limestone vessels. The point of limestone vessels, like the stone jars in John chapter 2, is that they remain ritually pure. Pottery can become impure from a ritual point of view, whereas stone jars cannot be made impure. It's like using glass or using Pyrex rather than pottery for certain kinds of cooking if you don't want the oil and so on to soak into the material. So this is just a quick overview of that particular site. You can see the basilica in the background, and in fact we had some photos from this space under here showing the cave structures. These photos came out 2 or 3 years ago, caused a lot of excitement, evidence of first century presence. In fact, the wider walls are Mamluk walls, I've now learned, because I've learned a bit more about Mamluk materials. So what we have here are cave structures occupied in perhaps the first century, and above the top of them we have other structures built from the Mamluk period, and I've got dead ringers for those walls from the Mamluk period at Bethsaida. So I'm beginning to, sad though it be, I'm beginning to recognise Mamluk walls at 100 metres. So we have layer upon layer of presence. That's not the question. The question is how might we date the first layer? And the suggestion appears to be consistent with very simple, not very sophisticated development, very modest agricultural settlement around the turn of the era. Last decade or two of the previous century and the first decade or so of the Common Era. The final set of resources, archaeological resources that are worth looking at, are tombs. There are a number of graves and tombs scattered around the Nazareth area. This one happens to be the inside of a rolling stone tomb underneath the cave house from the Sisters of Nazareth. But some other time we can talk about tombs and graves. I may be excavating one of these in a year or so's time. So a number of graves have been identified. Several of them have been studied. Most of them haven't been fully published as yet, but they do give us a sense of where the boundaries were, because under Jewish ritual law, you buried the people outside the village. You didn't bury them inside the village. That's one of the cultural markers. So it gives us a sense of the boundaries and helps us to be sure that we were talking about a very, very small period. And all of these graves, with their grave products, as they're called, begin in the Herodian period. None of them are any earlier, but they do begin in the Herodian period. And if there are dead people there, then before they were dead people, they were live people. Okay, that's how they got to be buried there. So there's no continuity. We do have Bronze Age and Iron Age material in the area, including around Nazareth, but this is a totally new cultural phase unconnected with those earlier periods. So we're on to the last slide. These are some of the artefacts in the little museum at the Basilica in Nazareth, and they'll just look like a handful of dirty pots and pans, really. The most significant item in that set of collection are the 4 oil lamps across the bottom, because 3 of those, not the second from the left, but the other 3 oil lamps are Herodian oil lamps, and Herodian oil lamps are one of 5 or 6 very significant cultural markers for a distinctively Jewish village in the Galilee, 30 or 40. They really run from the time of Herod, 40 BCE, through to the end of the 1st century. Then that style of lamp went out of fashion. Okay? So people who were using these lamps were not only Jewish, they preferred to import Herodian oil lamps from Jerusalem, and they were only made in Jerusalem. We can tell that from the pottery analysis, the clay analysis, and it was they were choosing not to buy the lamps from Sepphoris. They were buying their lamps from Jerusalem because they were kosher. So what do we have? First century Nazareth. We can see that there were people there from the Stone Age. In fact, there are Stone Age presence from about 9000 BCE, but that's not the agricultural developments that we find. We find permanent occupation on the present site of Nazareth beginning in the Herodian period. It's a very small settlement, 500 metres by 500 metres. The well was about 500 metres that way. They appear to have been observant Jews from Judea. This, of course, runs against some of the work by my friend and hero Dom Crossan, who wants to talk about the Hellenistic character of the Jewish communities in the Galilee, and now we're saying no. Actually, when you dig up their garbage, they were Jewish. They were kosher, and they were not into Hellenistic stuff, thank you very much. A tiny little village, observant Jews, too small for a synagogue building. Cop that, Luke chapter 4. Okay, no sermon in the synagogue in Nazareth, because there was no synagogue in a little dump like Nazareth in the first century. Possibly a communal oven, a communal wine press, and a communal threshing floor, because they're the essential things that a bunch of farmers need to have when they first set up camp to create a new farming village. Perhaps not more than 300 to 500 people, and most of them would have been children, because mum and dad didn't have the pill. So they made babies. Year after year after year they made babies. Now, of course, half of the newborn babies were dead within 12 months. Half of the ones that survived 12 months were dead before 5. We're talking third world mortality rates. That's the kind of dynamic that Jesus probably came out of. And maybe not more than 25 or 30 families comprising this settlement. And then because it becomes interesting that in the New Testament traditions, while the sisters are never named, although they're mentioned, the male siblings of Jesus all have good Jewish religious names, including Jesus himself, Joshua. Okay, so Mary and Joseph are naming their kids after the heroes in the Jewish sacred story. These, if they were Catholics, it'd be Bernadette and Maria and so on, okay? But they're not. They're Simon and Jude and Joseph and Joshua and so on. So good Jewish names, the heroes of the ancient sacred tradition, are the names that are attached to the sons of Joseph and Mary. Okay, we're pretty well at the end of this part of the presentation. I just want to mention that has come out in a book, but you don't want to buy the book, it's way too dear. The chapter is on academia.edu if you just want to download the chapter. And there'll be a video version of this, but there is one from Canada a couple of months ago as well. And some of this stuff has informed a couple of the chapters in the early part of Jesus Then and Jesus Now. Okay, time for a break? Or
Yes,
some questions first and then a break? I'm happy to take some. I'm not paying attention to the time, so you just kind of manage me.
That's
but
okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to take some questions now. Then I think we have a short break, stretch our legs, go to the loo, whatever. We'll come back and we'll jump into more of the... So what are we going to do with Jesus now as distinct from hunting for Jesus back then? Graham?
The lamp on the second from the left, you said was not...
Yeah.
Not Jewish?
No, I said it wasn't Herodian. It didn't have the square Herodian.
Right.
I'm a coin man.
Was?
No, I'm a coin man, not a pottery man.
Because I had one at home.
Ah, okay. Yeah. I'm happy to take it off, you know. So.
You're essentially talking about Jesus, who was a human being, flesh and blood, just like us.
Yep.
Here. But yeah, what about his ascension, and what about living in heaven and all that sort of stuff?
Sure. Well, none of those are relevant to an inquiry into the historical Jesus or the historical circumstances of Nazareth in the first century. It's hard enough to find evidence of a village of people dropping rubbish on the street, let alone to find evidence of somebody who disappears up into the sky. I mean, that's not... You can't take a photograph. There were no cameras. there's no historical evidence for those kind of stories, but we do know that every significant character in the ancient world, like emperors and so on, when they died, they ascended into heaven. That was part of their career move as they went from being dead emperors to living gods. So an ascension story is a common motif, like the car chase scene in a movie. The ascension story it's a motif that you will find in literature from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era. So it's interesting, it only occurs in Luke, and Luke is the most Hellenistic, the most plugged in to Roman culture of the evangelists. And I would say Luke was writing about 140, 150. So he's even more embedded in Roman culture. He certainly wasn't there, and similarly for Luke, Luke assumes that Nazareth was a Greek city with a synagogue, and the city was built on a hill like the Acropolis in Athens, okay? Because when Jesus upsets them with his sermon in Luke chapter 4, they try to throw him off the cliff of the hill on which their city was built. There is no such hill in Nazareth. Luke had never been there, and he imagined Nazareth as being like a Greek city with an Acropolis, because that's what a storyteller will do, and that's okay for me. I'm interested in history, but my sacred stories do not have to be historical. Okay, they still work for me, but they don't have to be historical.
Greg, I can't help wanting to ask you this question about John chapter 2 and Nathaniel, because you mentioned about bandits, and you said that there were perhaps ways of protecting people from bandits. And I want to put that together with the story of Nathaniel, where Nathaniel says, "Oh, Rums, can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Now, this is John's gospel, and even end of 1st century. So, do you think that that's a anti-bandit or anti-insurrectionist view from the writer of John's gospel about Nazareth?
Okay. The short answer is no, but I will unpack it a little bit. I think the background is that earlier on, so Herod becomes king of the Jews in 40 BCE, but for 10 or 15 years before that, his dad has him working as governor of the Galilee on behalf of the Hasmoneans, and that's when he has to suppress the bandits. Okay, and now the bandits are still there, and of course the zealots and Reza Aslan and all the rest. Banditry is not sort of organised crime. Banditry are people that are pushed to the point where they cannot survive by working on the land, and they can only survive by, if they've got into debt and they don't want to be sold as slaves, they'll head for the hills, they'll hide in the caves, and they'll try and extort enough income. They're bushrangers more than mafia. So they're almost cultural heroes to certain elements of the population, but not to the ruling class, whose job is to keep the place quiet, or else the Romans will come and sort us out. So I don't think Nazareth is being confused as a centre of banditry. If it was, we'd hear about it. I think it's more of Nazareth. It's more a case of... John's story would presuppose that Nathaniel, the character Nathaniel, at least associates Nazareth with Galilee. Okay, which is actually not bad, given that so few people had heard of it. But I don't think it's bandit. I think it's more of, you've got to be kidding. The promises are all about Judea. Jesus has to come from Bethlehem. And so it's particularly fascinating that the Christians, Matthew and Mark arranged for him to have a Bethlehem zip code on his birth certificate. Not that there was a birth certificate, but they connect him with the messianic birthplace. But they both end up, one way or another, getting him back to Nazareth, because the tradition is persisted in saying this guy is from Nazareth, which has no theological street cred. There's no advantage to the early Christians. They should have said he was from Bethlehem, and they should have had stories about him in Bethlehem. Now, what's going on there? So I think that the fact that the Christians can make no theological use of the Nazareth connection is one of the most significant arguments in favour of the Nazareth connection being authentic.